She leaned close, her voice barely more than a breath. "Keep quiet." But with her standing that near, with her eyes holding mine in the hush of the library, staying silent was the last thing I could do. It was one of those afternoons when the world outside felt too loud, and I needed somewhere quieter to breathe. That's how I found myself wandering into the library, a place I hadn't visited in months. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. The outside noise was left at the door, replaced by the soft hush of turning pages and the faint scent of old paper. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but alive. And then I noticed her. She stood behind the desk near the far window, a woman in her early 40s, perhaps, with an air of calm authority. Her posture was graceful, upright without being rigid, and she moved with the kind of ease that comes only from years of confidence in her own skin. Her hair caught the warm light slipping through the tall windows, strands of chestnut threaded with lighter tones, pulled back just enough to frame her face. She wasn't just beautiful, though she was. It was something deeper. There was a steadiness about her, a presence that drew my attention like a magnet. I told myself to keep walking, to pretend I was here for books and nothing else. But every step I took seemed to pull me closer to where she sat, adjusting her glasses as she wrote in a thick ledger. When her eyes lifted from the page and landed on me, I froze. Just for a second. They were sharper than I expected, intelligent, observant, the kind of eyes that notice more than you want them to. I tried to offer a polite smile, something casual, but before I could, her lips curved just slightly, and she whispered across the quiet room. "Keep quiet." Her voice was soft, yet it carried. Not stern, not scolding, more like a gentle reminder wrapped in velvet. The words brushed against me in the silence, closer than the space between us allowed. I wanted to laugh, maybe apologize, though I hadn't spoken a word. Instead, I nodded, pretending to busy myself with a row of books. But inside, my pulse had quickened. It wasn't her words that had caught me off guard, it was the way they felt. As though she'd stepped nearer without moving at all. I reached for a book I didn't care about, pulling it from the shelf just for something to hold. Yet I found myself glancing back at her, again and again. She had already returned to her writing, the tip of her pen scratching softly across the paper. Her expression was composed, calm, but every so often, as though she sensed me watching, her gaze flicked up. And when it did, I felt it, the quiet spark, subtle but undeniable. There, in that hushed room filled with nothing more than shelves and sunlight, the story began. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, flipping through its pages as though I had a purpose in being there. But the truth was, every word blurred together. The only thing sharp in that room was my awareness of her. She sat back at the desk now, head tilted slightly as she read over some papers. Every few moments she adjusted her glasses, the motion smooth, practiced. There was nothing extraordinary about it, and yet, to me, even that small movement carried weight. I drifted further down the row of shelves, pretending to browse. My fingers traced over spines worn with age, the titles barely registering. I wanted to believe I was subtle, that my presence didn't disturb her, but every now and then, I could feel it, her eyes. It was the kind of gaze you don't catch head-on, but sense like a change in air pressure. Quiet, deliberate, not intrusive, just there. And when I finally dared to look, I caught it. For the briefest moment, her eyes lifted, meeting mine across the stretch of bookshelves and polished floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away as quickly as most people might when caught staring. Instead, she held the glance steady, unhurried, and then returned to her work as if nothing had happened. Something inside me shifted then. A pulse of curiosity. A flicker of something I wasn't ready to name. I moved to another aisle, letting the sunlight follow me. The late afternoon glow streamed through the high windows, painting the wooden floor in long amber streaks. Dust floated in the beams, turning the silence golden. And there, framed by the light, she looked like she belonged more to this place than the books themselves. I leaned casually against the shelf, letting my shoulder rest against the wood. From here, I could see her in profile, the curve of her cheek, the graceful line of her neck, the way her lips pressed together as she concentrated on her work. She was beautiful in a way that felt untouchable, like art you admire but don't dare approach. And yet, when she shifted in her chair, her eyes found me again. It wasn't an accident this time. I knew it. She knew it. A pause, long enough to make the space between us feel smaller than it was. And then, almost shyly, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, as if acknowledging something neither of us would put into words. The silence pressed in, but it wasn't heavy. It was alive. Every glance, every flicker of her expression, carried more meaning than sentences could. I should have walked away. Found a book, sat down, blended into the background like any ordinary visitor. But I couldn't. Instead, I lingered in her orbit, caught in a quiet game where neither of us spoke, but both of us knew. Every glance was a secret. And in that library, where words were stored by the thousands, silence had somehow become the loudest thing between us. I don't know how long I wandered the shelves, pretending to search for something. Time seemed slower inside those walls, stretched out by the hush of the air and the weight of unspoken glances. But eventually I felt her presence draw closer. Her footsteps were soft, measured, almost cautious, yet they echoed in my awareness louder than anything else. When I turned, she was there, just a few paces away. The librarian. Her presence filled the narrow aisle more completely than I thought possible. "Are you finding what you're looking for?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, low enough to respect the silence of the place, but steady in a way that demanded attention. She wasn't just being polite. She was curious. I shifted the book in my hands, clearing my throat. "Honestly, I don't even know what I'm searching for." It was the truth. And maybe that's why her lips curved, just slightly. Not a full smile, but something softer, hidden. She tilted her head, as though studying me. "That's usually the best time to discover something unexpected," she murmured. The space between us seemed to shrink with each word. Her hand reached out, brushing against the edge of the shelf as if for balance, though I wondered if it was more than that. For a fleeting second, her sleeve grazed mine, fabric whispering against fabric. The smallest touch, yet it lit something alive under my skin. She leaned closer, scanning the spines beside me. "This section is more history than fiction. Were you looking for something lighter?" I should have answered simply. I should have told her yes, or no, or anything that would have kept things ordinary. Instead, my words came out quieter, more personal. "I think I was looking for quiet." Her eyes lifted from the books and locked on mine. And there it was again, that sharpness, that piercing way she seemed to look straight past the surface. For a moment I worried I'd said too much, revealed too much. But then she breathed out softly, the corners of her mouth curving again. "Quiet," she repeated, her voice almost a whisper. "That's one thing we have plenty of." I chuckled under my breath, the sound louder in the silence than I intended. She tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Keep quiet," she said, her tone playful this time, the words carrying a trace of warmth instead of warning. I should have nodded, should have fallen into the role of obedient guest. But something about the nearness of her, the weight of her gaze, pushed me to answer differently. "Not with you so close," I murmured back. The words escaped before I could stop them. Bold, maybe too bold. My chest tightened with the risk of it, the chance that she might step back, remind me of the boundaries we both knew were there. But she didn't. Her eyes lingered on mine, steady and unflinching. And though her lips pressed together as though to hold back a response, the faintest blush of color warmed her cheeks. She turned slightly then, her composure slipping back into place as she reached for a book, sliding it from the shelf with practiced ease. But in the subtle quiver of her fingers, in the way her breath caught just faintly before she spoke again, I knew she had felt it too. That shift. That quiet crack in the stillness. The first real conversation, and it had already said more than words ever could. The aisle narrowed as we walked side by side, her book in one hand, mine in the other. I should have stepped back, given her more room, but I didn't. Something in the closeness felt deliberate, unspoken. We reached a heavy oak table tucked near the window, its surface scarred with years of quiet study. She laid her book down first, opening it with careful precision. The pages fanned open under her touch, her fingers brushing lightly across the paper, as though she respected every line of ink. I placed mine beside hers, and before I knew it, we were leaning shoulder to shoulder, both gazing down at words that neither of us seemed to really be reading. Her hand rested near mine on the table, so close I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin. The distance between our fingers was no more than a breath, and it seemed impossible not to notice. My pulse moved with a steady awareness of that space, that nearly touching space. She leaned in slightly, pointing to a passage. The edge of her sleeve grazed my wrist, soft fabric against skin. A casual gesture, unintentional maybe, but it sent a ripple through me. I wondered if she felt it too, if the pause in her words, the subtle catch in her breath, was more than coincidence. The library around us was quiet, as always, but now the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of her breathing near mine, the faint vanilla warmth of her perfume mingling with the scent of paper and polished wood. The smallest movements, her turning a page, me leaning closer, seemed magnified in the stillness. I tried to focus on the book, but my eyes betrayed me, sliding toward her instead. The way the light from the window traced her profile, the curve of her cheek, the steady set of her jaw. She carried herself with a kind of restraint, as though she was always aware of boundaries, always careful not to step too far. Yet in that moment, her restraint felt like it was cracking, if only just enough for me to see through. Our hands shifted almost at the same time, hers sliding a little closer as she traced a line of text, mine moving slightly as if to steady the page. And then, there it was, the faintest touch. Her finger brushing against the side of my hand. Neither of us pulled away. For a heartbeat, maybe two, the world stilled. Her touch wasn't bold or deliberate, it was softer than that, almost accidental. But the silence that followed made it clear it wasn't nothing. I breathed in slowly, careful not to shatter the moment. She didn't look up right away. Instead, she let her hand linger just a second longer before retreating, her composure folding neatly back into place. But when her eyes finally met mine, they carried something unspoken. Something the quiet had given us permission to feel. And in that silence, I realized the most dangerous thing wasn't the touch itself. It was how much I already wanted it again. For a while, we sat there in that fragile closeness, pretending to be absorbed in the books before us. But I could sense it. The way her focus wavered, the way she shifted in her chair as though something inside her was unsettled. Finally, she drew back just slightly, resting her hand on the edge of the table as if to create space that hadn't really been there to begin with. Her eyes lowered to the open page, though I could tell she wasn't reading anymore. "You shouldn't linger here too much," she said softly. Her tone was steady, but there was something beneath it, a tension, a hesitation. I tilted my head toward her. "Why not?" She hesitated. Her fingers toyed with the corner of the page, smoothing it again and again. Then she sighed, so quietly it was almost a whisper. "Because I don't usually let people get close." Her words hung in the air between us, delicate but heavy. She wasn't talking about proximity to bookshelves or library tables. She meant herself. I stayed quiet for a moment, letting her speak if she wanted. She didn't meet my gaze right away. Instead, she stared at the faint light spilling across the table, her expression caught somewhere between resolve and vulnerability. "It's easier that way," she continued, her voice steadying as though she was reminding herself. "People come and go. They take what they need, and they leave. And I've learned not to expect more." There was no bitterness in her tone, only quiet acceptance, the kind that sounded practiced, as if she had repeated this truth to herself too many times. I felt the weight of her confession, the quiet loneliness stitched into her words. And for a moment, I wondered if she regretted saying it aloud. Her posture was straighter now, her chin lifted, as if bracing for judgment or dismissal. But all I could think about was how human she seemed in that moment, not just graceful, not just poised, but real. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low, steady. "I don't see you as someone people just pass by. I couldn't, even if I tried. Her eyes flicked to mine then, sharp and searching. For a moment, she looked almost startled, as though she hadn't expected me to respond with anything but silence. I swallowed, my chest tightening with honesty I couldn't hold back. I don't notice your age, or your walls, or any of the reasons you might think I should keep my distance. I just notice you. And that feels like more than enough. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Her hand, still resting on the edge of the table, trembled just faintly before she drew it into her lap. The mask of composure she wore so easily seemed thinner now, more transparent. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain. Not weak, never that, but vulnerable, in a way that made me want to steady her, to show her she didn't have to carry everything alone. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't filled with glances or quiet games. This silence was deeper, heavier. It carried trust. And in that trust, I felt the beginning of something that neither of us could quite name yet. The library grew emptier as the evening stretched on. A few scattered footsteps echoed and faded until, finally, it felt like the building belonged only to us. The golden light from the tall windows had softened into a dusky glow, and lamps on the tables flickered on one by one, casting warm pools across the wood. She moved quietly through the space, closing a window that rattled faintly from the breeze. I followed her without thinking, my footsteps softer than usual, as though I didn't want to break the spell that had settled over the room. When she reached for the heavy frame, it resisted. I stepped in beside her, my hand brushing against hers as I took hold. Together, we pushed it closed, the weight yielding only when we leaned in at the same time. For a second, our hands overlapped fully, warm against warm. We didn't move them right away. The silence between us deepened, not empty, not awkward, but full, like the air before rain. I could feel her breathing shift, slower, heavier. When I looked down, her eyes were already waiting for mine. "You make it hard to keep quiet," she whispered. The words left her lips so softly, I almost wondered if I had imagined them. But the tremor in her voice, the faint flush warming her cheeks, those were real. They betrayed the truth she had been holding back. For a moment I couldn't speak. My chest tightened with the weight of what she had just admitted. This woman who carried herself with such composure, who seemed untouchable in her grace, was letting me see what lay beneath. I leaned just a little closer, my voice low, steady. "Then don't." Her eyes widened slightly, as though the simplicity of my reply had disarmed her. She drew in a slow breath, her lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. Instead, she let the silence stretch, and in it, everything we hadn't said seemed to speak for us. Her hand slipped back, not to retreat, but to rest lightly against mine. The touch was deliberate this time, not accidental, not hidden. Her fingers lingered there, testing the fragile boundary between restraint and surrender. The lamp nearby glowed against her hair, catching on the strands that had loosened around her face. She looked softer now, less guarded, though her eyes still carried the weight of hesitation. "You're too young to understand," she murmured finally, but even as she said it, her fingers didn't pull away. I shook my head gently. "Maybe. Or maybe I just understand you more than you think." She held my gaze for a long moment, long enough that I felt my heartbeat match the quiet tick of the clock behind us. And then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders lowered, her guard softening. No kiss. No dramatic gesture. Just that quiet confession, spoken with her hand in mine, the silence pressing in around us like it was listening. And somehow, that was more powerful than any words could have been. The clock on the far wall ticked softly, its hands edging closer to closing time. The library had grown almost completely still, the outside world fading into the muted glow of lamplight and shadow. For a long while neither of us spoke. Her hand remained against mine, light but steady, as though even the smallest movement might break whatever fragile truth we'd uncovered. She was the first to breathe out, a quiet exhale that sounded more like surrender than fatigue. Her eyes lowered briefly, then returned to mine with a softness I hadn't seen before, less guarded, less careful. "I don't usually," she began, but her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish. I already knew what she meant. I gave her hand the faintest squeeze, not enough to demand, only enough to reassure. You don't have to explain. Her lips pressed together, then curved slightly, not into a smile exactly, but into something that felt just as intimate. She looked away then, her gaze sweeping the shelves as if they might hold the words she couldn't find. I stepped a little closer, careful, slow. She didn't move back. Instead, she let the space between us close naturally, as though it had been waiting all evening to disappear. When her shoulder brushed against my chest, I felt her still. For a heartbeat, I wondered if she'd retreat. But then her body softened, leaning just enough to rest against me. Her arms didn't wrap around me right away. She simply let her weight ease into mine, her cheek brushing lightly against my chest. I froze, afraid even to breathe, afraid the moment would vanish. But then I felt it, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, faint but sure, pressing through the quiet into me. I let my arms rise slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, I slipped them around her, holding her gently, not tightly. She was warm, softer than I expected, her presence both grounding and electric. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence was no longer a wall between us, it was a home, a place to rest. I lowered my cheek toward her hair, catching the faint scent of vanilla and paper. My eyes closed for just a moment, letting myself memorize the feeling, her steadiness, the weight of her trust, the quiet certainty that she was letting me in. When she finally spoke, it was so soft I almost missed it. You're dangerous, you know. I smiled faintly, though my voice came out low, earnest. Only if dangerous means wanting to stay. Her laugh was quiet, almost hidden in her breath, but it was there. And when she leaned back just enough to look at me, her eyes carried something new, not fear, not hesitation, but a fragile kind of hope. We stood there until the lights above flickered, a gentle reminder that the evening was ending. But when she stepped away, she didn't step far. Her hand lingered in mine, her thumb brushing over my knuckles as if she was testing the idea of letting go and choosing not to. And in that simple, wordless gesture I knew. The silence between us had given birth to something that wouldn't end with the closing of doors. Something lasting. Something neither of us had expected, but both of us now quietly claimed. 2.